Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers, and welcome to another episode. Today we have with us Colin Snider. How are you doing today, Colin?
Doing well, warm but well.
So where are you?
I'm in Texas.
You're in
Tyler,
Texas?
Texas, yes.
Yeah, how warm is it there?
Probably upper 90s, I'd say.
Yeah, we are 90 degrees here in Lexington, so it's quite warm. And I just got back from Seattle, which is decidedly not 90 degrees and decidedly not humid. So it's
Yes.
far different here than it was there. Can you remind me of what's your affiliation?
I'm at the University of Texas at Tyler,
University
in
of
the
Texas.
Department of History, yes.
So you have, over the years, become our Brazil correspondent. And in fact, we spoke last time a couple months ago before the impeachment of the president. And quite a bit of stuff has happened since then. And that's why we're here. So what has been going on since the last time we spoke?
Well, it depends how much time we have. So the president was impeached, as you mentioned, before the impeachment. The Chamber of Deputies in Congress did vote to impeach in April. In what many saw as a farcical exhibition of demagoguery. I will be a little blunt here, because the charges that were brought forth, as we discussed last time, were over this question of budgeting, basically. Could she sort of claim certain funds came from a place when they weren't necessarily there or not, which was an entirely legal practice when she had done it in 2014. So those were the official charges of impeachment. But when you had most of the, of course, Brazil's Congress with several hundred members, and each of them was given a little bit of time to talk, so it was a very long process, about 7 or 8 hours, and maybe more. I'm not remembering now, but I spent a whole day in front of the computer.
Now, were both for and anti allowed to talk, or just for?
Both. Anyone who voted was allowed to speak for, I think it was about 6 minutes or so. And so it was a lot of bizarre, like that they were voting against corruption, which isn't really what this was about, right? There were corruption scandals, but they hadn't been tied to the president. One very famous right-wing demagogue by the name of Jair Bolsonaro, who's an apologist for the military regime of 1964 to 85. He said he was doing this in honor of the dictatorship, and in fact, in honor of the general, or the man who he died a couple years ago. He was responsible for the arrest and torture of Dilma and many others. So he dedicated, his vote against this president who'd been tortured to her torturer. So it's just, one woman said it was, she was honoring it, doing it in honor of her husband who's been fighting corruption, and the very next day he was arrested for corruption. So it was a very, farcical procedure, but it went through, and then the Senate upheld it. So on the one hand, Dilma has been removed from office from 6 months, and her vice president, Michel Temer, has become acting president. And he got to create a whole new cabinet, which is a bit unusual in the Brazilian system, that if the president's removed, the cabinet goes as well. And there was much controversy around that selection, that it was all white men, which, suffice to say, in Brazil's population is not necessarily fully representative of the population writ large. And within his first month, again, he's in power because of this alleged removal of a president over corruption. And within his first month of the presidency, 3 of his ministers have to step down over corruption. And the Senate voted in favor of maintaining the corruption proceedings. So she will be going through trial here in the coming weeks. And in the meanwhile time, the president of the Chamber of Deputies, Eduardo Cunha, who had led the charges against Dilma Rousseff for corruption, and who had himself been very much connected to multiple cases of corruption. They found multi-million-dollar shell accounts in his name in Switzerland. There have been recordings of him sort of involved in this process of trying to get her out. And he broke with her government last year, and they sort of saw this as what it really was probably him trying to save his hide, and that failed. So that he has been stripped of the presidency of the Chamber of Deputies, though he remains in his office as a deputy and as a member of parliament effectively. And in fact, just today I saw his son's diplomatic passport has been revoked. And just last week, then Brazil elected a new president of the Chamber of Deputies, and it was a weird election in which both of the final candidates were favorable to the president, but is sort of seen. You have members of the PT voting for the ultimate victor, who's from the right-wing Democrat Party. And which is not like in the United States, they're saying Democrat parties pejorative. They call themselves Democrats. That's the party's name. Right. And so they sort of saw, like, why would some left parties vote for this far-right neoliberal who's very much on board with Temer's program of neoliberal reductions, that he's, his government the Congress politely raised its incomes even while it cut funding to education and health and whatnot under budgetary needs. And the basic idea is that Cunha, as president, had sort of created a new bloc that was loyal to him. And so this vote was actually kind of a restoration to the idea that you have to work across parties and not have necessarily this single person leading a coalition in the Congress. And that's sort of where we are today.
Right. So we have 6 months, or there's a clock ticking, so it's less than 6 months for the trial of Gilma, right? Is that correct? Now,
it's supposed to be 6 months, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How this whole thing is such foreign territory that we'll see how that actually works out, because it should arrive right at the heart of the Olympics then.
Right, and so that's part of my question. So constitutionally, she was removed from power, and that removal from power is it just a flat 6 months, or can it go beyond that, or?
It's supposed to be a flat 6 months,
Mm-hmm.
but again, the Olympics and sort of all this other material going on is complicating matters adequately. Where some are saying it needs to happen sooner, others are saying it can't happen during the Olympics, and it's not real clear. I mean, the one thing you can say about this whole process, besides its unexpectability, is the pace of change, like how quickly matters can be complicated, and it feels very much like it's being done on the fly. Mm-hmm. So. It's supposed to be a hard 6 months. As a betting man, I would put money on both sides, whether it's exactly 6 months or more than 6 months, because it's just such a unusual circumstance. And the one thing I forgot to mention too is even with Temer, he's acting president. He's actually legally not allowed to run for office because he was found guilty of misappropriating campaign funds. But they didn't remove him from office. They just said you can't run for the next 8 years. But he didn't have to run to be president. He just sort of inherited the post from being vice president.
Well, that's simultaneously sketchy, but also I can see the genius to that. So.
Yeah.
Now, what are Gilma's prospects in the Senate? I mean, what do things look like they're going to be? I mean, what are the standards of evidence? Is it like, is there a bloc aligned against her?
Yes, the prospects aren't good. Not because of any necessarily illegal activity or wrongdoing on her part, because again, the whole penalatus fiscalis was that this notion that the government could basically use public funds from one treasury and say it's sort of the budget's at a certain point, even if it's not necessarily there. And that's something that her predecessors across party lines had done. Lula had done it, and so had Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and dozens of governors have done it. So it is now illegal, but she herself helped make it illegal in 2015, saying, fine, if you're upset about this, then this can't happen any longer. So on the legal grounds, the prospects would seem to be very slim, but it's such a strong anti-Gilma sentiment. And the people who were worried about, or claimed to be worried about corruption, weren't. Not just in terms of the Congress, but in terms of the populace more generally. The middle classes and conservatives really wanted her out. And so this was, there's talk of, is this a coup? Is it not a coup? But those who say it is, the argument being that it's a really sketchy removal of a president from office for baseless charges. But I would say she's probably going to be removed permanently because of the sheer antagonism to her and the sense that she's become a scapegoat for the bigger problems in Brazil's political system itself and the economy. And it helps, too, that in this, I don't love conspiracy theories. I think they tend to give international capital sometimes a little too much power over the local interests, but which can also be capitalist, of course. But banks, major news outlets, your Wall Street journals and whatnot, they love the new president because they're saying he's bringing responsibility back to government, even though he's the one who's actually been convicted of corruption. But it's because he's embracing these sort of neoliberal policies and cutting spending to the disenfranchised groups that had benefited under the PT.
So back to this coup question, right? I mean, the way we determine it would be these are extraordinary but technically legal means, and if extraordinary but technically legal means constitute a non-coup, then it's not a coup. But if they constitute a coup, then it's a coup, right?
Right.
We're not looking at something like, and actually this you sort of brought in this, you bring up the word, and we have to worry. This is not something like we've seen in Turkey where there has been any, right? And so and we don't expect to see anything like that.
No, not at all. And it's funny, actually, because just the other day, Gilma herself had sort of commented that, she can relate to what's going on in Turkey, where they had a coup too, and it's, snarkily pointed out, well, no, it's totally different in Brazil because in Turkey it failed.
Right.
So yeah, I think the closest analog for Brazil is really what happened in Paraguay in 2012, in which you have this case of violence between farmers and police, which it's still not clear what happened. That they've sentenced a bunch of the farmers to death or to jail for the deaths of police, but none of the police have been even tried or charged for deaths of farmers. And basically, Congress uses that to blame the president, who's sort of a new, like Gilman herself and the PT, sort of a new actor, and remove him institutionally in what are very sketchy, but by the letter of the law, legal mechanisms. An equivalent would be finding out that impeaching Obama because an IRS office in, San Antonio had done something weird, and blaming him at the top, even though there's no connection between the federal government. Like, it's just a local idiot doing something wrong, and they sort of use partisanship and ideology to go after the big cat.
Right. So what sort of social fallout has there been? I mean, there was obviously a great deal of street unrest back when we were talking about this and when this started. Has there been a counter-mobilization or anything? Or, I mean, has there been any kind of social reaction beyond just what's going on in the government?
Yeah, I mean, there's the hashtag that's constantly going on of Fora Tamer, or out Tamer. So the joke, like, what's Tamer's first name? Fora, rather than Michelle. So there's a lot of anger, but it's interesting you ask this, because there were polls that just came out this past Sunday in Brazil that 50%, a third of the country doesn't know the name of the acting president, which taps into, I think, in part, not just the instability over the last several months, but also the disconnect between politicians and daily lives. But also 50% want him to remain in office, which isn't necessarily a love of him, but more of, this is already embarrassing enough, kind of mentality. Like, it's too unstable as it is, no more. But 33% also want Dilma back. So there is still a strong sentiment, but with the upcoming Olympics, with the uncertainties of what's going on, and it can't be overstated the degree of corruption going on here that far exceeds the presidency. So that one of the things that brought one of the ministers of Tamer's government down was that he was actually caught, and this again sort of retroactively confirmed what most people suspected the night of the impeachment in the Chamber of Deputies. He was caught on the phone with somebody else who's basically an informant ultimately for the government. Or he'd been arrested as a businessman and was ratting out everyone he knew and singing like a canary. And they're on the phone saying, maybe if we can just get her out of office, all these investigations into us will disappear. And we can stop that. And so he had to step down. So there's such cynicism everywhere at this point that I think a lot of people are just sort of, that there is opposition, but it's such an unusual and strange, arena at this point that there's only been impeachment once before in Brazil, and that was in 1992 with Fernando Collor, and there was overwhelming evidence of his corruption. And he resigned before he could be fully impeached. So, and he was still stripped of his political rights. So, sort of impeachment as political tool has an uncertain outcome, and so I think that's and that plus the furor over the Olympics and just a sense of fed-upness is kind of not eliminating social mobilization, but at least dampening it a bit.
Now, you mentioned about the stripping of the political rights. Is that what will happen with Dilma if she is convicted of this? Will she be unable to run again in the future?
I think legally she'll be able to run. I just don't know. Practically no. I mean, maybe like a local office, if she could, if she wanted to run for a Chamber of Deputies in one particular district, or even Senate, state. Although, and one of the charges against her has always been that she never had run for anything before president, that she'd always been a technocrat. So I don't think, again, it's been such chaos that I could be completely wrong on this in 3 weeks, but I don't think they would go so far as to strip her of her political rights fully. I think the impeachment would pretty much take care of that for her. And at that point, it'd be like, could Nixon run for office again after 1973? Legally, yeah, but who's going to vote for him? And what's complicating matters, too, is that she would have to leave office in 2018 no matter what, because it's the end of her 2-year term. And there's been much talk about Lula running for election again, because you can serve 2 consecutive terms only in Brazil, but there's no cap on that. So you can do 2, take some time off, and come back for another 2. And in that poll I mentioned earlier, he wouldn't win the second round against any of his opponents, but he would lead in the first round against all of them. And so, that the idea being that maybe she was just a bad option for that party, a holdover, and the real leader of the PT will return, would make her ability to run for office more dubious as well.
Right, and so that's interesting. So he remains a viable candidate, but there were also corruption cases against him as well, right? I mean, so he's not. Is he out of the legal woods, or is there still a move to exclude him?
I think removing her was always kind of about removing him in a way, like denying the validity of the PT itself. But the problem is the progress that was done under the PT, especially in the 2000s, where you had these real social programs. Because even though Temer is an absolute neoliberal, but Dilma was taking austerity measures herself by the end. And so, whereas Lula had not, he did a very good job of sort of balancing these quote unquote market friendly policies with social reforms and social programs. And it's not an accident that his programs those are the ones that are being gutted first. So he remains really popular because he is sort of affiliated with that time where Brazil was the country of tomorrow today. And again, it can't be overstated, and you even see this in the numbers for Gilma and sort of the regional breakdown of support. The areas that benefited most from those social reforms and sort of led to social mobility for the lower classes and the lower middle class, the PT still enjoys great popularity. But he, much like Gilma, he's also such a divide. Like, the elites and the middle classes hate him by and large. So it's very much a polarized circumstance where he does enjoy support. And again, he leads all possibilities in the first round. But when they put him against the theoretical possibilities of Jose Serra, who's already lost the presidency twice and is tied to these corruption scandals himself, he would lose to Serra. Or if he ran against Marina Silva, who was, I believe, she's former environment minister and had been in the government, and then left and joined a separate left party, he would lose to her as well.
Okay.
And this is all 2 years out, so God knows what happens given just the last 9 months, what happens in the next 24.
Right. I mean, Donald Trump might lose and he might move to Brazil and he might become president there. Who knows?
Yeah, he's big in Brazil.
So how is this then play? How are the Olympics playing out against the backdrop of this, right? So, I mean, what you suggested that there are some interactions, some synergistic effects here, right? That the Olympics are playing this role about, hey, whatever's going on, we kind of have to calm this down before everybody shows up, right? Is that inaccurate, or is there? I mean, are there any sort of interesting protests or other sorts of demonstrations planned to use the Olympics as a platform?
There have been protests. Yeah, there. Sort of just your small groups, but the bigger it's a much broader social. I'll even call it malaise. That there is another poll that just came out that most Brazilians are not upset by the Olympics, but embarrassed. That they actually feel shame as the Olympics approach because you have all of these problems politically. The whole world mistakenly thinks Brazil is some like Zika haven. That just anyone, and you see this with a lot of the athletes, which it's their decision, that's fine, but it's really been blown out of proportion that if you go to Brazil, you'll get Zika and everything will be terrible and we'll all die. And first of all, it's August in Rio, which is the low season for mosquitoes, that most of the Zika almost all of the Zika cases, like the major area of concern was well over 1,000 miles away from Rio. I mean, it'd be like there's a Zika outbreak in Dallas and people refuse to go to New York City.
Right.
And so there's a sense that there's, this shame over that, the political turmoil has added to this malaise, and then it's just the infrastructural problems, that the subway probably won't be ready, that they spent millions of dollars on a bike trail in the southern zone, which benefits the elites, so people could come to and from the Olympics on bike and foot, and it collapsed, and it was like 9 months old, and it collapsed and killed 3 people, and of course the construction company is tied to the people who are now implicated in these corruption scandals that might have involved kickbacks. The sewage issue in the water, which is not a new issue, that anyone who's been to Brazil for a long time, on that ride from the airport to the center of the city, you pass these poorer neighborhoods in the north, and you can see and smell the fetid water. So none of this is new, but now the attention's really turned on it. That it's a problem that Brazilians themselves had often, by and large, ignored, except for the poor populations that were most immediately affected by it. But now the international media is there. The gross inequalities that are so visible in Rio in particular, where you have really, really wealthy high-rises next to mountaintop slums. And Brazil's, Rio's tried to cover that up, but they've actually built a wall to sort of block off a view of those favelas from the airports to downtown Rio and to the southern zone.
Right.
That all of this sort of feeds into this general, like that this is a thing that's not going to make them look good at all. And it was supposed to. And for all the criticism Brazil gets for that, I put that as much on the IOC.
Right.
That's anything. And there's there's problems like the state is saying it doesn't have enough money to pay for the Olympics now and it needs the government to bail it out, which some say is just a cynical move on the state that they're just trying to get money and get off the hook. And every other state's now saying, oh wait, we don't have money either. We need federal funding. So it's just such a mess that I think all of these things are feeding into one. It's like one massive vortex that involves the political, the social, the athletic, in this broad, and it's almost repressive in its dissatisfaction, so that people can't even in large numbers come to the streets. And I mean, there are people in the streets. I want to make that clear. And there are protests and there are social groups operating. Mm-hmm. But if you think back to 2013, where we had 1 million people in the streets in Rio and in Sao Paulo over corruption issues not related to the current ones, not at least not immediately. So you're not seeing those kinds of protests, no.
So, I mean, really, and I don't know how much this has occurred to you, but I think it does seem like it's a trend. I mean, it's going to be increasingly hard to convince any country that's not Russia or China to host the Olympics in the future. Yeah. It seems like, right? I mean, there has to be, either an extremely wealthy country, but the problem is in wealthy Western countries, even the United States, right? I mean, it's increasing just the disruption caused by the games is increasingly, making sort of G7 countries less interested in this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
and not just that, the World Cup too. I mean, the fact that Brazil just had the World Cup, including Rio having the final, and how much money, that was one of the main issues behind the 2013 protests was how much federal money had gone into these stadiums. You spent millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars in Manaus for a nice stadium when Manaus doesn't even have a top level soccer team. And so, and then the Olympics only add to that, just this week I was reading, there's a report that, of course, the Olympic housing was supposed to provide housing for people afterwards, and now they're already saying, it'll probably be abandoned. There is, you look at the upcoming World Cups, the 2018 is Russia, 2022 is Qatar, and there is opposition to places like Los Angeles or Chicago trying to get to the Olympics.
Mm-hmm. Right. Do you know anything at all? Have you paid anything at all to the attention, or any attention at all? I know this is going a little bit afield, but any attention at all to the situation with the Russian athletes in the 2016 Olympics? I've only sort of vaguely.
Yeah, I'm aware that there's apparently some systemic anti-doping. There's anti-doping measures being taken place with support of the state. And for the longest time, there were sort of these denials, but when then the latest report comes out, and when Putin even says we will fire those responsible for that, this must be actually kind of a legitimate thing, because you're not just straight up denying it. You're, if even you were saying those responsible will be fired. I do I'm a little ambivalent on it, because there's always no matter, it's the dynamic of you make something illegal, they'll just find new methods. And it's also, maybe it's not, I mean, I don't know that much about it, but the whole, I view it like punishing a college football or basketball team for his players this year for something that the school did 5 years earlier before they were even there, that maybe some of them there have doped this time, but this seems to be like you're angry about the Winter Olympics 2 years ago, so you're punishing those in the Summer Olympics now. Right.
By the way, incidentally, what sports is Brazil normally strong at? What areas does it dominate in the Olympics? Do you have any idea?
Beach volleyball. For visible reasons. Regular volleyball. They actually have. When I lived there, I learned that soccer was number one, but volleyball was a close second in terms of national popularity. And so volleyball, they're very popular. And then you have individual athletes who are good at events like swimming or certain track events.
I did read an article about Brazil. Brazil was in fact doing very well among the Latin American division in hockey in preparation for the. But that that was not necessarily the sort of the most elite company for for the next time around for the Winter Olympics. So. Just not because only sort of sketchy things happen in this part of the world, but I do want to come back to sort of a pan Latin American question in just a bit. But I also wanted to dwell for a touch on the situation in Venezuela, because I know you pay attention to Venezuela as well, and then of course it's going through its own crisis, which is in sort of every metric more desperate than the crisis that Brazil is currently going through. Right? I mean, Brazil is sort of having this fascinating introspective crisis, whereas in Venezuela there's literally 16,000% or 1,600% inflation in the streets right now. So, I mean, what is going on in Venezuela right now, and how much have you been paying attention to it?
I've been paying moderate amounts of attention to it. It's bad enough that even Venezuela has opened the borders with Colombia so that people can go buy goods, and that Colombia is, glad to. Someone said, "Well, why did Colombia do that?" And why would you want more money? If
I can pause you for a second too, and this sort of relates, and maybe we can talk about this too, which is sort of the way in which North Americans view Latin America, but especially Venezuela. I recently read an article in The Nation about and it virtually had the quoted marks around it, the crisis in Venezuela, and I don't know if you saw the article, but you've probably seen some things like this, and The Nation has a particular editorial perspective. And, paraphrasing would almost be, they have not yet begun to feast upon each other's entrails. So how can you call this a crisis in Venezuela? And then described a whole series of horrible things about, virtual complete social collapse, but wanted to frame this as, well, but it's really not that bad.
Basic necessities like toilet paper, yeah, like, oh, who needs that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's bad. It's really bad. And it's in part because the oil economy is doing poorly. And this is one of the big $1 million questions that's still going to take some time to figure out, is how much of this is Chavez's policies before he died, and how much of this is Maduro? Is this a question of Chavismo itself has failed, or is this a question of somebody who wasn't capable ended up in a position of power upon Chavez's death? And I have no problem sort of preemptively diagnosing that, at least in part, this is the perils of institutionalizing reforms in an individual rather than in a party or a system, is that you can develop cancer and die. And if it's this personalist politics, all that goes away with you. Whereas if they're, and the Castros have sort of lived long enough to see this coming and have begun to work against that in a way. But there has been reform of the Communist Party in Cuba, and they're aware that changes need to happen, whereas Chavez didn't have that time or didn't bother to do it. But I also, Maduro was repeatedly incompetent as well.
I mean, it does seem that there are two basic structural problems here, which Chavez could not have altered. I mean, one of which is the collapse in oil prices, and second, and you probably could speak more to this, was the sort of insufficient investment in oil industry infrastructure, right? And so both of these, I mean, people were warning about the investment back when oil was just still gangbusters, right? Everybody was signing, this is a real problem. Unless you solve it right now, you're going to have disaster. And that seems not to have been resolved.
Yeah, and I think, and that's the $1 million question too, is because he died 3-4, was it, God, how many years ago was it he died now? 3 years? Would he have done something differently? Because the gas price drop has been relatively recent, right, in the last 10 months or so, and I'm not sure anybody, even the experts, saw, like, when even they were saying, holy cow, we're below $2 again. Even we didn't think it was going to be this low. So, yeah, I think parts of this isn't to exculpate him. I think absolutely some of this is the system, but the question then is how much of it's Maduro. And where it gets really curious in the past week is, of course, that Maduro is naming a general, sort of the top person in charge, like that Maduro is still the president, but he ceded this degree of power to this general that's just really remarkable. And there's some chatter going on. Is this kind of an internal coup that you don't usually see a civilian just fork over that much power to a military official that quickly? And it's not a big secret that some within the government who are loyal to Chavez, especially within the military, don't like Maduro and where he's led the country. And so there's sort of this question, is this coup-ish? Where Maduro was basically informed, you can do this yourself or we can throw you out. And he's in such a position of weakness, he had to accept those terms. So it's not real clear if we're going to get a return to Chavismo, how much the military is running this show now. I'm more confident in predicting the near future on this one than I am on Brazil. It's not going to get good anytime soon because it's still, and this is the problem Latin America as a region is confronting more generally, and Brazil's encountering the same problem, is for a while in the 2000s it was diversifying its resources that it was shipping out, but Latin America still ended up becoming overly dependent on China.
Right.
And of course they're getting hit hard in the global economy, and they're sort of part of the problem with the collapse in the global economy now. And so for all this talk that the quote, and I hate the term, but the quote unquote pink tide had changed things in Latin America, it turns out upon reflection that some countries have done pretty well for themselves. Bolivia in particular might be the one that alarms or surprises most people. But places like Argentina or Brazil or Venezuela, they didn't ditch the dependency model, let's call it. They just swapped out who they were dependent upon. And it turns out the commodity markets are still pretty problematic.
Right.
And Venezuela is really suffering the most extreme version of this, because at least Brazil had and has internal industry, right? It has, and that's problematic, but it's because the whole system was corrupted for politics. But and those kickbacks, Argentina has some sense of internal market. Venezuela lags far behind on all of those fronts.
Now, why is Bolivia doing so well? How has Bolivia sort of surfed the pink tide?
they've got lithium, so they're still dependent in a way, but they've got one that everyone still really needs in that market, and it's such a big market that they have such a large part of the market. But Morales has also done a pretty good job of trying to avoid becoming too beholden to one country. I think that it's a small enough economy in a way, and there hasn't been some of the metric for Bolivia to do well versus the metric for, let's say, Brazil, which has, and I don't even mean like economic metric, but simply the psychological metric that Brazil's stuck with this sense that it's, for centuries, there's been this notion of, in various manifestations, sometimes imposed from within, sometimes from without, of the need to join the developed world and be a leader because it's so big, because its economy is so large. Bolivia, to my knowledge at least, doesn't have this sort of cult of being the country of tomorrow. So it could take more piecemeal steps, and wasn't as beholden to just oil. It's still dependent on exports, but Morales, I think, has done quite a good job of sort of being internally focused and not trying to grab a ring he can't reach.
Right, but even when you find lithium or some other thing like some rare earth like it that is, you still run the risk of a general global downturn or of a substitute good being developed. Right,
and he's done some really. It's sort of bringing the drug trade. Part of the thing I think that has helped is that he legalized coca leaf growing, right? Because the problem was so many people. That's a natural part of indigenous culture in Bolivia, in particular, and in the Andes more generally. And the art for those who argue that the war on drugs is actually what creates the drug problem. Bolivia is a kind of a good textbook example if you want to point to how that might be the case in some instances, because by legalizing it, you didn't have then all of this sort of peasant economy that's by its nature illegal and therefore constantly attacked through defoliation programs and through because that's what hit Colombia so hard in the 70s and 80s and 90s was go after the fields, but don't provide any alternative sources of income for these people. So you have this sort of rootless mass that's a major problem for the economy. I think in part by doing something like that and legalizing it for internal production alone, that you can still get tea. They're not making cocaine. The cocaine market has plummeted in Bolivia, and you have an informal, or not an informal, but a peasant economy that's left intact and can self-perpetuate.
So, we are obviously in the midst of this horror show in Cleveland. So, thus far in I think it's fair to say that, pan-Latin American issues have not emerged as a central area of debate, arena of contestation in the 2016 presidential election. But you're obviously far more attuned to this kind of thing than the rest of us. Now, beyond some of the obvious things like let's build a wall to Mexico and make them pay for it, what have you listened to and what have you heard from the presidential candidates that sort of give any indication as to what the future of Latin American policy looks like in the United States? I don't know if you've read, and I think he's already withdrawn himself from consideration, but Admiral James Stavridis has had significant Latin American connections. He was recently mentioned as Clinton's VP.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Well, see, there we go. But so I'm wondering, but has anything about this election so far made your ears perk up in terms of policy?
No, it's sort of been the standard. There have been a couple of lip service. I haven't had a chance to look yet, but I know the Republican Party platform has something in there very quickly about it. It's typical, right? That it's either this complete disregard for Latin America, or it's this very vague notion that we need to improve relations between the United States and Latin America that presumes that they're bad to begin with, and that's been the MO since 2001, pretty much. We've said we need to improve relations for centuries or decades and generations.
When both parties took the butcher communist plank out of their platforms and didn't really know how to replace that.
Right. We need free market policies. And you had the Washington Consensus in the 90s. But there's this notion now that Latin America doesn't like the United States, which in part may be true for historical reasons, but it's also very simplistic, right? That there are plenty in Latin America who do like the United States, but that it's always such an afterthought. And especially, so on the one hand, it's either complete disregard, or it's this vague notion that relations are bad and they need to be improved without ever offering any substantive arenas of where they need improvement or why. And I think the other issue that's sort of, I'm not surprised that it's not really entering the discourse this year beyond the immigration issue. It's only coming up in Honduras with Hillary is the other one, right? But that also just like this is such a try to be polite here, but such an unusual year, and such a tumultuous year. But whether it's the issue of racism or in the United States, or these questions over who's America, or even this, and obviously the biggest foreign policy issues, the sort of Islamic State question and the idea of foreign terrorism at home and whatnot. That in some regards, this in a weird way kind of reminds me of the early 2000s after 9/11, where Bush had made all these promises to pay attention to Latin America, and then 9/11 happens, and just our gaze turns towards the Middle East and towards Southern Asia. And I think we're sort of seeing that never went away, but it's being refocused and sort of in a new way that again is leading to a disregard for Latin America. What will be interesting to see is that Brazil just is alleging they have rooted out a group that say that they're working with the Islamic State and we're going to attack the Olympics, and they've made some arrests, and that they just deported somebody who is an Algerian back to France, I believe, because who was making threats. So how much fear that may tap into outside of Brazil, or how legitimate that is, it remains to be seen. But that might be the one way where suddenly Latin America enters into U.S. political discourse more prominently, but not in a way that would be constructive, I don't think.
That's interesting, because for the very longest time, with some cause, as we learned in sort of the case of Argentina and the bombing of the Jewish Community Center, but generally it was Iran and Hezbollah, right? I mean, if you talked to people who were really on the pretty far right of the immigration debate, they would always bring up the sort of Hezbollah's penetration of Mexican drug gangs and so forth. Well, usually presented without much in the way of evidence, but there were sort of general,
because there was none,
right, general arguments that Hezbollah was moving in. But it's very interesting. I hadn't heard the ISIS thing, but it's an interesting claim.
And it's just, again, this has just been the last couple of days where this has happened, so we'll see how much meat is behind this. But and the other question too is then how much of this is a Latin American issue and how much of this is an Olympics issue. Right? That is it. I don't think it's an accident that they're finding it in Brazil just as the Olympics are about to arrive, when you do have all these Western countries who've typically been the target, the quote unquote Western countries who've typically been the target of these attacks. Arriving, that maybe they think this is a soft target, to use their terminology. And I'm not sure how much of this is actually a Latin American issue as opposed to a try to hit the West, the European and North American countries where you can.
To your knowledge, have Brazilians really had time to form an opinion of the Donald Trump phenomenon in the United States?
Oh, yeah, because he was trying to build a hotel there, I believe. That was full of his typical braggadocio that did not always seem to reflect the experiences on the ground or the lived realities of this. He's seen, as I suspect he is in most of the world, which is a complete clown show. And that's not entirely my own politics, but that's just sort of the language. Like, what is the United States doing? How is this guy even? How can anyone take this man seriously? And there's almost, they're not they're offended, but it's sort of the sit down and grab the popcorn offense. Let's just watch this. So for the country that celebrates itself as the birthplace of democracy, let's see how this turns out.
Yeah, no, I mean, a friend of mine in the UK recently made this point that people in the United Kingdom made quite a bit of fun, have been making quite a bit of fun of Trump, and then now look, they have Boris Johnson as their foreign minister. So
and to be fair to Brazil, they're sort of like, some of them are looking at Trump like, well, at least we're not quite that bad yet. But there's also a very broad sense like, well, who are we to judge? Look at our own clown show.
All right, Colin, do you have any other thoughts before we close the day?
No, I'd say that would do it.
All right. Well, Colin, thank you very much for joining us. It's been fun as always, and we'll hopefully do another one of these maybe after the Olympics and see where things are going from there.
See what happens with the impeachment from there.
All right. Well, thanks so much, and thank you, Foreign Entanglements viewers. We hope you enjoyed, and please leave any comments in the comment section.